she should never have heard the crying at all. The blizzard had been howling for 3 hours, wind screaming down from the peaks with enough force to bend the pines horizontal, and Sarah Chen had closed every window, locked every door, sealed herself inside the rehabilitation facility like a woman determined to shut out the world. Which, in fairness, she was. Christmas Eve had always been hardest. 3 years ago, on a night almost identical to this one, she'd lost the adult wolf she'd been treating for a broken leg, watched the light fade from its amber eyes despite everything she knew, everything she'd tried. The failure had followed her like a shadow, whispering that some things couldn't be saved, that her hands weren't enough, that caring too much only led to devastation. So she'd requested this assignment, this remote mountain facility where the nearest town was 40 miles of winding roads away, where she could spend holidays alone with injured hawks and recovering foxes and the blessed silence of professional detachment. But the silence broke. Faint and high-pitched, barely audible over the storm's rage, a sound that shouldn't exist reached her ears as she was locking the medicine cabinet. Crying. Not human, not quite animal, something in between that made her spine straighten and her breath catch. She told herself she'd imagined it. The wind played tricks, created voices in the spaces between gusts, made a person hear ghosts when they'd been alone too long. She turned back to her inventory checklist. The crying came again, more insistent this time, a desperate mewling that pierced through the walls like a needle through fabric. Sarah's hand stilled on her clipboard. Professional instinct warred with professional exhaustion, the part of her that had chosen isolation fighting against the part that had chosen this work in the first place. The crying didn't stop. She grabbed her heavy coat and headlamp, pulled on boots still wet from the evening rounds, and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, wind stealing her breath, snow already accumulating in drifts that reached her knees. She followed the sound, that thin thread of desperate noise that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, because nothing should be alive out here in these conditions. It led her to the loading dock behind the facility, a concrete platform where deliveries arrived once a week, now buried under snow and abandoned holiday decorations that hadn't been worth bringing inside. There, wedged between a rusted metal shelf and the building's foundation, was a red and white Christmas stocking, the cheap knitted kind sold in grocery stores, half frozen and dusted with ice. The crying was coming from inside it. Sarah's hands shook as she reached down, not from cold but from disbelief, from the impossibility of what she was discovering. The stocking was heavy, heavier than it should be, and when she opened it with fingers already going numb, she found herself staring at something that defied every law of nature she understood. A wolf pup. No more than 2 weeks old, eyes barely open, covered in matted grey fur that was stiff with ice. Impossibly, incredibly small, fitting in her palm when she lifted it free, weighing perhaps a pound, maybe less. Its breathing came in shallow gasps, body temperature so low that Sarah couldn't feel any warmth at all, just the faint flutter of a heartbeat against her thumb like a moth trapped against glass. The pup's eyes found hers, unfocused and clouded, and made a sound that wasn't quite a whimper, wasn't quite a cry, but something older and more desperate, a plea that transcended species. Sarah's professional assessment came automatically, the clinical part of her brain cataloging observations even as her heart clenched. Severe hypothermia. Dehydration. Possible frostbite on the paws. Birth weight suggesting premature birth or runt of litter, abandoned because it couldn't keep up, couldn't compete, was deemed by nature itself as not viable. Survival probability, nearly zero. She should call the State Wildlife Office. Follow protocol. Document the discovery. Let nature take its course. But the pup cried again, that impossible sound, and Sarah found herself tucking it inside her coat, against her chest, and running back through the blizzard toward the facility's door. She was crossing a line. She knew it even as her boots hit the steps, even as she shouldered through the entrance and kicked the door shut against the screaming wind. Professional distance, the armor she'd built so carefully over 3 years, was already cracking. But the pup was dying in her hands, and Sarah had spent 3 years living with one failure. She wasn't sure she could survive another. The last time Sarah had tried to save a wolf, she'd been a different person. Confident, maybe even a little arrogant, certain that her degree and her training and her pure determination could overcome anything. She'd worked at a larger facility then, down in the valleys where the winters were gentler and the staff was plentiful, and she'd had supervisors to consult and colleagues to share the weight of impossible decisions. That wolf had been an adult male, magnificent and fierce, brought in by rangers after a car collision on the highway. Broken leg, treatable, or so she'd thought. She'd set the bone, administered antibiotics, monitored for infection, done everything by the book. For 2 weeks, the wolf had improved. Then, on Christmas Eve, something had shifted. Sepsis, maybe, or internal injuries they'd missed, or simply the trauma of captivity for a creature who'd never known walls. The wolf had stopped eating, stopped fighting, turned its face to the corner of the enclosure and refused to look at her. She'd stayed with it through the night, trying everything, but by dawn the wolf was gone, and Sarah's certainty had gone with it. She'd requested the transfer 3 days later. This remote facility, this isolation, this careful distance from anything that could hurt her again. But now she had this. This impossibly tiny creature that fit in her palm, that shouldn't be alive but somehow was, that had been crying in a Christmas stocking in a blizzard like some kind of terrible miracle. Sarah worked through the night with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly how fragile the margin between life and death could be. First, warming, but slowly, gradually, because rapid temperature change could send the pup into shock. She prepared a heating pad wrapped in towels, set to low, and nestled the pup into the folds, monitoring constantly. The pup's temperature, 79 degrees. Dangerously low. A healthy wolf pup should be around 102. Next, hydration. The pup was too weak to nurse, too cold to swallow properly, so Sarah prepared a feeding tube, the smallest she had, and carefully administered electrolyte solution, milliliter by milliliter, watching the pup's tiny chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a prayer she didn't quite believe in. The pup's heartbeat, thready, irregular, but present. Blood sugar, critically low. Respiratory rate, shallow but steady. She worked through her checklist with mechanical precision, each task a bulwark against the fear that whispered this was futile, that nature had already made its decision, that she was only prolonging the inevitable. But every 20 minutes, she checked the pup's temperature again. 81 degrees. 83. 85. Rising, slowly but rising, and Sarah felt something unfurl in her chest that she'd thought she'd buried 3 years ago. Hope. Dawn came grey and cold, the blizzard finally exhausted, leaving behind a world buried in white silence. Sarah hadn't slept. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the medical room, the heating pad in her lap, the pup nestled against her stomach, still breathing. 48 hours, she told herself. If the pup survived 48 hours, there was a chance. She tube-fed every 2 hours, monitored vital signs every 30 minutes, adjusted the heating pad temperature as the pup's body slowly, incrementally, remembered how to regulate itself. She didn't allow herself to think about what came after survival. Didn't let herself consider the implications of what she was doing, how this level of contact and care was already creating bonds that protocol explicitly forbade. The pup's survival was what mattered. Everything else was a problem for later. On the second night, 60 hours after the discovery, Sarah was changing the pup's bedding when it happened. The pup's eyes opened fully for the first time, focused instead of clouded, and fixed directly on Sarah's face. They were the color of storm clouds, grey-blue, and impossibly aware, and they held Sarah's gaze with an intensity that seemed far too old for something so small. The pup made a sound, not a cry this time but something softer, a chirp almost, questioning and tentative. Sarah's hand stilled on the towel. She should look away. Should maintain professional distance. Should remember every rule about imprinting and human contact and the importance of keeping wild animals wild. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "Hey, little one. You're going to make it." And the pup chirped again, a sound like recognition, like agreement, like the beginning of something neither of them could take back. If stories of impossible connections move you, if you believe that sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that break all the rules, consider subscribing to hear more tales of healing, hope, and the bonds that change us forever. Because what happened next would test everything Sarah thought she knew about love, about wildness, about what it means to save something that might just save you in return. The pup survived the first week, then the second, growing stronger each day with a determination that seemed to defy her size. Sarah named her Noel, partly for the Christmas Eve discovery, partly because it felt wrong to keep calling her the pup when their lives had become so thoroughly entangled. Noel was abnormally small, even for a young wolf, her body compact and delicate in ways that suggested she'd been the runt of her litter, the one pushed aside at feeding time, the one deemed expendable when resources were scarce. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in spirit. By 3 weeks old, Noel was strong enough to walk, her gait wobbly but determined, and she used her newfound mobility for exactly one purpose, following Sarah everywhere. Into the medical supply room. Around the examination tables. Through the corridors of the facility during evening rounds to check on the other animals. Noel's world had a radius of exactly however far Sarah happened to be, and if that radius expanded beyond 10 feet, Noel would chirp in distress until Sarah came back into view. Sarah told herself this was normal, that orphan pups needed contact, that she was simply providing necessary care. But she knew better. She'd worked with enough animals to recognize imprinting when she saw it, to understand that Noel wasn't just depending on her for survival anymore. Noel thought Sarah was family. Thought Sarah was pack. Thought Sarah was the entire world that mattered. And Sarah, despite 3 years of careful emotional barriers and professional distance and determination never to care this much again, found herself thinking the same thing about Noel. They developed rhythms, small domestic rituals that Sarah had never allowed herself before. Noel slept in Sarah's jacket, the same one she'd worn the night of the rescue, curled into the fleece lining like it was a den. When Sarah worked at her desk, filing reports and updating medical charts, Noel would lie across her feet, a small warm weight that seemed to anchor Sarah to the present moment in ways she hadn't felt in years. When Sarah ate, Noel watched with enormous eyes, not begging but observing, learning everything about this strange two-legged creature who smelled like medicine and safety. Sarah found herself talking to Noel in a way she hadn't talked to another living thing since the isolation began. Not baby talk, but real conversation, explaining what she was doing as she treated a hawk's broken wing, describing the mountains beyond the facility that Noel couldn't see yet, telling stories about the wolves she'd studied in graduate school, their intelligence and loyalty and complex social structures. Noel would tilt her head, ears pricked forward, and Sarah could almost believe she understood that some communication deeper than language was happening in the space between them. The first moment of pure joy came on a Tuesday morning when Noel discovered a pinecone that had blown in through an open door during supplies delivery. She pounced on it with exaggerated intensity, front paws slamming down with more enthusiasm than coordination, then jumped back in surprise when the pinecone didn't do anything interesting. She circled it warily, approached again, batted it with one paw. The pinecone rolled. Noel's eyes went wide with delight. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah sat on the floor and watched Noel chase the pinecone around the room, pouncing and tumbling and making tiny play growls that sounded more like squeaky toys than predators. And Sarah laughed. Actually laughed, a sound that felt rusty and unfamiliar, like muscles she'd forgotten she had. The isolation had made her forget what joy felt like, how it could arrive unbidden in the smallest moments, how it could pierce through years of careful numbness with nothing more than a wolf pup and a pinecone. But the joy came with a shadow, and the shadow's name was Dr. Marcus Webb. Sarah had known the inspection was coming. The State Wildlife Office required quarterly reviews of all rehabilitation facilities, and Dr. Webb, as director, conducted them personally with the thoroughness of someone who believed rules existed for good reasons. Sarah had met him twice before, during her initial facility certification and a 6-month follow-up. He was in his late 50s, with steel-grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, and he had a reputation for being fair but inflexible. Wildlife was wildlife, he believed, and humans were humans, and the line between them was there for the protection of both. His inspection was scheduled for late January. But when Sarah's phone rang on the second Tuesday of January, barely 3 weeks after Noel's discovery, it was Dr. Webb's voice on the line, and he was calling to move the inspection up. Tomorrow. He'd be there tomorrow. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone, her eyes finding Noel, who was sprawled in a patch of winter sunlight by the window, gnawing contentedly on a rope toy. Tomorrow. She had until tomorrow to figure out how to explain this, to justify what she'd done, to somehow make Dr. Webb understand that every rule she'd broken had been necessary, that Noel's survival had depended on exactly the kind of bond that protocol forbade. Is tomorrow convenient? Dr. Webb asked, his tone professionally pleasant. Sarah looked at Noel, at the pup who thought she was Pack, who would cry if Sarah left the room, who had saved Sarah as much as Sarah had saved her. Tomorrow's fine, Sarah said, and spent the rest of the day memorizing the weight of Noel in her arms, preparing for everything to change. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep, so she did what she'd started doing on the hardest nights. She told Noel about the mountains. They sat together in the observation room, the one with the large windows facing north toward the peaks, and Sarah held Noel against her chest while snow fell in silent sheets beyond the glass. Those mountains are where your family lives, Sarah said quietly. Not your birth pack, maybe they left you behind. But other wolves, wild and free, living the way wolves have lived for thousands of years. They hunt elk in the valleys. They sing to each other across distances so vast you can't imagine. They know every ridge and stream and hidden path through the forest. They're magnificent. Noel made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and burrowed closer into Sarah's chest. You're supposed to be like them, Sarah continued, and her voice cracked on the words. You're supposed to be wild. Running with a pack. Learning to hunt. Growing into something fierce and free. Not curled up in a facility with a human who doesn't know how to let go. But even as she said it, Sarah knew the truth was more complicated. Noel was 4 weeks old now, still absurdly small but growing, her personality emerging more clearly each day. She was brave and curious and gentle, nothing like the aggressive pup Sarah would have expected from a wolf. When the facility's resident foxes barked from their recovery enclosures, Noel didn't bark back. She tilted her head and listened, interested but not threatened. When Sarah had to handle an injured hawk, Noel watched from a safe distance, respectful of the bird's space, showing none of the prey drive that should already be developing. She was, Sarah realized with growing dread, temperamentally perfect for exactly the life she was living and completely unsuited for the life she was supposed to have. I failed once before, Sarah whispered into Noel's fur. 3 years ago, Christmas Eve. An adult wolf, beautiful and strong, and I couldn't save him. I tried everything, but it wasn't enough, and he died while I watched. I thought that was the worst feeling in the world, failing something that trusted me. She paused, feeling Noel's heartbeat against her palm, steady and strong, so different from that terrible night 3 years ago. But I think losing you might be worse. Because you lived. Because I saved you. Because this time I did everything right, and it's still not enough, because I saved your body but I stole your wildness in the process. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't know how to undo what we've become to each other. Noel looked up at her with those storm-grey eyes, impossibly aware, and licked Sarah's chin once, a gesture of comfort that felt more human than wolf, more friend than animal. Sarah held her tighter, watching the snow fall on the mountains where Noel should have been, where Sarah should have found a way to keep her. I won't let them take you somewhere that will hurt you, Sarah promised, though she had no idea how she'd keep that promise. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll fight for you. Even if fighting for you means letting you go. Even if it breaks me. You deserve someone who will do that. And Noel, who couldn't possibly understand English but seemed to understand everything that mattered, made that soft chirping sound again, the one that meant comfort, meant presence, meant I'm here and you're here and that's enough. They stayed like that until dawn, woman and wolf, watching the night give way to grey morning light, and Sarah tried not to think about how few mornings they might have left. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, stepping out of his official Wildlife Services vehicle with a clipboard and an expression of professional neutrality that Sarah had learned to read as caution. He was thorough in a way that suggested he'd been doing this long enough to know where problems hid, checking facility permits and medical supply inventories and enclosure specifications with methodical attention. Sarah answered his questions with careful precision, walking him through her protocols and success rates and current residents: 2 recovering foxes, a hawk with a healing wing, a juvenile raccoon nearly ready for release. Standard cases. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise concerns. Until Dr. Webb reached the medical room, pushed open the door, and stopped. Noel was in her pen, a specially modified crate with soft bedding and warming lamps, and she'd been sleeping when the door opened. But the moment she saw Sarah, she scrambled to her feet and pressed against the crate's bars, whining in a way that was unmistakably, "I know you, I need you, why aren't you here with me?" Sarah watched Dr. Webb's face change, professional neutrality shifting to something harder, more concerned. He looked at Noel, then at Sarah, then back at Noel, who was now crying in earnest, her distress obvious and entirely directed at Sarah. "How long have you had her?" Dr. Webb asked, his voice carefully controlled. "For weeks." "And you found her where?" "Outside, in a stocking, during the Christmas Eve blizzard. She was hypothermic, dehydrated, barely alive. I didn't have time to call it in. She wouldn't have survived transport." Dr. Webb crouched down in front of the crate, observing Noel with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked with wolves for decades. Noel ignored him completely, her attention still fixed on Sarah, whining continuously now, a sound of pure need. "She's imprinted," Dr. Webb said flatly, standing. "This is exactly what we can't allow, Sarah. You know that." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, felt 3 years of isolation and professional distance and careful control threatening to crack. She was dying. What was I supposed to do? Let her freeze? You were supposed to call it in. Let us handle it. Follow protocol. She would have died before anyone could get here through that storm. I made the only choice that gave her a chance. Dr. Webb sighed, a sound of genuine regret rather than anger, and that somehow made it worse. "I understand why you did it. I do. But look at her, Sarah. She thinks you're her mother. She's bonded to a human in ways that make her completely unfit for wild release. Do you understand what that means? She can't be rehabilitated. She can't go back to a pack. She's trapped between worlds now, and that's exactly what our protocols are designed to prevent. So what's the alternative?" Sarah demanded, and she could hear her voice rising, could feel the desperation bleeding through. "What happens to wolves who can't be wild? Where do they go?" Dr. Webb's expression softened slightly, sympathy mixing with professional resignation. "There are sanctuaries. Large enclosures with other wolves, educational facilities where she'd have quality of life even if she can't be released. But she needs to be socialized with her own species, not with humans. The longer she stays with you, the harder that transition becomes." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She knew he was right. Knew that everything he was saying came from experience and research and a genuine concern for Noel's welfare. But knowing it was right didn't make it feel any less like devastation. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "End of the week. I'll arrange transport to Mountain Ridge Sanctuary. They're experienced with situations like this, and they have several young wolves she might integrate with. You can do the transport yourself if you'd like. Stay during the initial introduction period." It was a concession, a kindness he didn't have to offer, and Sarah recognized it as such. Dr. Webb wasn't cruel. He was just playing by rules that existed for good reasons, rules that protected animals from human selfishness, from the damage that came from treating wild things as pets. Rules that Sarah had broken from the moment she'd brought Noel inside from the blizzard. 5 days, Sarah repeated, and nodded, not trusting herself to say anything else. Dr. Webb completed his inspection in silence, signed off on her facility certification, and left with a final piece of advice: don't make this harder than it has to be. Clean break is kindest. But as Sarah watched his vehicle disappear down the snow-covered road, then turned to find Noel pressed against the crate bars, still whining, still waiting, she knew there was no such thing as a clean break. Not for something that had already become part of your heart. 5 days should have been enough time to prepare, to emotionally ready herself for what was coming, but Sarah discovered that no amount of time would ever be enough to prepare for losing Noel. She spent those days trying to give Noel what she should have had from the beginning: exposure to the wild, to the sounds and scents and sensations that should have been her birthright. They went outside every morning, Sarah carrying Noel through the snow to the facility's outdoor observation area, a fenced space that overlooked the forest. Noel would stand at the fence line, nose twitching as she processed the information flooding in: pine sap and animal tracks, the distant call of ravens, the clean sharp smell of winter air that held secrets Sarah would never understand. Sarah watched her during these moments, looking for signs that Noel recognized something, that some instinctive wildness was waking up inside her. But every time Sarah took a step back, creating distance, Noel would immediately turn and run back to her, pressing against Sarah's legs, reassuring herself that her anchor was still there. Wild sounds interested her. Wild places intrigued her. But Sarah was home, and Noel never hesitated in choosing which mattered more. The nights were hardest. Sarah had started sleeping on the floor of the medical room, unable to bear the thought of being separated from Noel by even a few walls during these last precious days. Noel would curl against her stomach, her breathing gradually sinking with Sarah's, and Sarah would lie awake memorizing details: the exact pattern of grey and white in Noel's fur, the way her ears twitched during dreams, the small sounds she made when she was content. Sarah had started journaling again, something she hadn't done since graduate school, filling pages with observations that were as much about herself as about Noel. "She's teaching me that isolation isn't safety," Sarah wrote on day 3. "I thought if I stayed apart, if I didn't let myself care too much, I could avoid being hurt again. But Noel didn't give me that choice. She just existed, needed me, trusted me, and somehow in the process of saving her, she saved me from the prison I'd built. I'm not numb anymore. I'm terrified and grateful and heartbroken and more alive than I've been in 3 years. And I think that's the gift, even if it ends in loss. She reminded me that being alive means risking pain, that connection is worth the cost of eventual separation." On day 4, Sarah packed Noel's belongings, her favorite blanket, the rope toy she'd grown attached to, the Christmas stocking she'd been found in, carefully washed and folded. She included detailed medical records, dietary information, behavioral notes. She wrote a letter to the sanctuary staff explaining Noel's history, her personality quirks, the things that frightened her and the things that brought her joy. She tried to translate everything that mattered about Noel into words on paper, knowing it was impossible, that no document could capture what this small creature meant, how she'd changed everything. That afternoon, the facility janitor stopped by, an elderly man named Tom who came twice a week to handle maintenance and had worked at the facility longer than Sarah had been alive. Sarah had barely spoken to him beyond professional pleasantries, another casualty of her self-imposed isolation. But Tom had seen her with Noel, had watched their relationship develop through windows and during his rounds, and now he stood in the doorway of the medical room with an expression of gentle understanding. "Heard you're taking her to Sanctuary tomorrow," he said. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Tom was quiet for a moment, watching Noel play with her pinecone, oblivious to what tomorrow would bring. "Had a dog once," Tom said finally. "Best friend I ever had. Grew up together, him and me, from the time I was 7 years old. He lived to be 16. When he got sick, really sick, the vet said we could try treatments, drag it out maybe a few more months. But the dog was tired, you know? Ready. So I held him while they gave him the shot, and I told him he was a good boy, and I let him go." Tom paused, his weathered hands gripping his tool belt. "Hardest thing I ever did. Thought it would destroy me. But you know what? It didn't. Because I realized that the best thing I'd ever done wasn't keeping him with me. It was loving him enough to know when holding on became selfishness. Sometimes the best thing we do is love something enough to let it go." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, the first she'd allowed herself since Dr. Webb's visit. What if she doesn't understand? What if she thinks I abandoned her? Tom smiled sadly. She'll understand what matters. That you loved her. That you gave her a chance. That's more than most creatures get in this world. He left quietly, and Sarah sat with his words, holding Noel close, trying to believe them. That night, the fourth night, Sarah let herself cry properly, and Noel did something she'd never done before. She climbed up Sarah's chest, stretched up to her full height, and licked the tears from Sarah's face with single-minded determination, making small concerned sounds until Sarah wrapped her arms around her and just held on. "I love you," Sarah whispered into Noel's fur. "I'll always love you. Even when we're not together. Even when you've forgotten me. I'll remember this. I'll remember you." And Noel, who couldn't understand the words but understood everything that mattered, pressed closer, and they stayed that way until dawn arrived, beautiful and terrible, bringing the morning Sarah had been dreading. The winter sun rose slow and golden, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of amber and rose, and Sarah thought it was cruel how something could be so beautiful on a day that felt like an ending. The drive to Mountain Ridge Sanctuary took 6 hours through winding mountain roads, each mile feeling like a countdown. Sarah wanted to stop but couldn't. Noel rode in a carrier in the passenger seat, close enough that Sarah could reach over and touch her, and for the first hour Noel whined continuously, that high-pitched distress call that meant "I don't like this is wrong, why aren't you holding me?" Sarah talked to her the entire drive, her voice steady even though her hand shook on the steering wheel, telling stories about the sanctuary, about the other wolves Noel would meet, about the large enclosures with trees and streams and space to run. She tried to make it sound like an adventure, a wonderful new chapter, but her voice kept catching on the words, betraying the lie. By hour 3, Noel had gone quiet, and somehow that was worse than the whining. Sarah glanced over to find her pressed against the carrier door, nose pushed through the ventilation holes, staring at Sarah with an expression that looked too much like understanding, like betrayal, like "Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, because there was nothing else to say, no explanation that would make this make sense to a creature who only understood presence and absence, belonging and abandonment. The sanctuary appeared at hour 6, a sprawling complex of large enclosures built into the mountainside, each designed to mimic natural wolf habitat as closely as captivity allowed. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the sanctuary director, met them at the entrance with a warm smile and competent efficiency that immediately reminded Sarah of who she used to be, before the isolation, before the failure, before Noel. "You must be Sarah. And this must be our Christmas miracle." Dr. Yuki crouched down to peer into the carrier, and Noel shrank back, pressing herself into the far corner, making herself as small as possible. "She's terrified," Sarah said, her voice tight. "She's only known me. This is all new." Dr. Yuki nodded with understanding. "We'll take it slow. Let her adjust at her own pace. We have a youth enclosure with 3 other pups around her age. They were born in captivity, very social, good candidates for teaching her wolf behavior. It might take a few days, but most pups integrate beautifully once they realize the humans here aren't permanent fixtures." The words were meant to be reassuring, but Sarah felt them like knives. The humans here aren't permanent fixtures. Because at a proper sanctuary, wolves learn to be wolves, not dependent on individual people, not bonded to one specific human who'd broken every rule to keep them alive. They toured the facility first, Sarah carrying Noel's carrier, and it was impressive in every way: large naturalistic enclosures, expert staff, clear protocols for minimal human contact, wolves living in family groups that functioned like real packs. Everything was designed to give the animals the best possible life in captivity, to honor their wildness even in confinement. It was exactly where Noel should be. Sarah hated it. But she followed Dr. Yuki to the youth enclosure, where 3 pups were tumbling over each other in play, their movements fluid and coordinated in ways that Noel's had never been. They were larger than Noel, more confident, their play punctuated by mock fighting and dominance displays that looked rough to human eyes but were normal for developing wolves. Sarah felt her stomach clench. "Are you sure she's ready for this? She's so much smaller." "Size doesn't determine pack dynamics as much as temperament," Dr. Yuki assured her. "And the best way for her to learn wolf behavior is from other wolves. Let's try an introduction." They brought the carrier into the enclosure's introduction area, a smaller space that allowed controlled first meetings. Dr. Yuki opened the carrier door, and for a long moment, Noel didn't move. Then Sarah knelt down, and Noel burst out of the carrier and straight into Sarah's arms, burying her face against Sarah's chest, trembling. The other pups approached, curious and excited about the newcomer, bouncing forward with the exuberance of young wolves who didn't know anything about boundaries or fear. The largest pup, a male with dark grey fur, bounded up and tried to engage Noel in play, snapping at her hindquarters in invitation. Noel yelped and pressed harder against Sarah, making no move to defend herself or play back. "Give her a minute," Dr. Yuki said gently. "Let her feel safe first." But Noel didn't feel safe. Even as the minutes passed, even as the other pups backed off and gave her space, Noel stayed glued to Sarah, whimpering, her whole body rigid with fear. When Sarah tried to set her down, to encourage her to explore, Noel's whimpers escalated to panicked cries, her claws scrambling against Sarah's jacket, desperate to be picked up again. "This isn't normal," Sarah said, her voice sharp with worry. "She's terrified." Dr. Yuki's expression had shifted to concern. "Let's try putting you outside the enclosure." Sometimes having the human visible but not accessible helps the pup engage with their own species. Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to grab Noel and run back to the truck and drive 6 hours home and never let her go. But she'd come here for Noel's benefit, not her own comfort, so she carefully set Noel down and stepped out of the introduction area, moving to the observation side where a chain-link fence separated them. Noel watched Sarah go, her storm grey eyes enormous, and the moment the gate closed between them, she ran to the fence and began to cry, a desperate howling sound that was nothing like wolf communication and everything like a child calling for its mother. The other pups approached again, less cautious now, interpreting Noel's fear as an invitation to establish dominance. The dark male pup rushed forward and snapped at Noel's flank, harder this time, not playing. Noel spun to face him but didn't snap back, didn't show teeth, just dropped into a submissive crouch that should have ended the interaction. Instead, it seemed to trigger something in the other pups. They surged forward as a group, and what happened next happened too fast for Sarah to fully process. Teeth flashing. Noel yelping. The other pups attacking not with the restraint of play but with the viciousness of a pack rejecting an outsider, something that smelled wrong, acted wrong, didn't understand the rules. Dr. Yuki was through the gate in seconds, Sarah right behind her, both of them wading into the mass of pups to pull them apart. Sarah grabbed Noel, who was bleeding from a cut on her ear and a deeper gash on her shoulder, crying in a way that sounded more emotionally broken than physically hurt. The other pups backed off immediately when the humans intervened, tails wagging like nothing wrong had happened, like they'd just been establishing the natural order. Sarah held Noel against her chest, feeling the pup's heart hammering, feeling her own heart breaking, and looked at Dr. Yuki with something like fury. This is what's best for her. Dr. Yuki's face was grim as she examined Noel's wounds, her professional composure shaken. That shouldn't have happened. The introduction protocol usually works. But she... Dr. Yuki paused, choosing her words carefully. She acted like prey. Didn't defend herself, didn't communicate properly. The other pups read her as weak, as other. Her imprinting made her vulnerable in ways I didn't anticipate. So what now? Sarah demanded, her arms tightening around Noel, who had gone quiet and limp, shock setting in. We try again in a few days, after she's healed. Sometimes, no. Sarah's voice was flat, final. Look at her. She can't do this. She can't integrate. You said it yourself, she's imprinted, she acts wrong, the other wolves know she's different. So what happens to wolves who can't be wild and can't be captive with their own kind? Where do they go? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Animals that couldn't be released and couldn't integrate into sanctuary settings had very few options, and most of them ended with euthanasia being called humane. Dr. Yuki was quiet for a long moment, looking at Noel, at Sarah, at the problem she'd seen too many times before with no good solutions. Then she said, slowly, carefully, there might be another option. It's never been done in this state. But looking at her, at what she's become, it might be the only humane choice left. Dr. Yuki led Sarah to her office, gesturing for her to sit while she pulled out files and paperwork, her movements quick and purposeful. Noel was curled in Sarah's lap, her wounds cleaned and bandaged, her body small and warm and trusting in ways that made Sarah's chest ache. Educational Ambassador Animal License, Dr. Yuki said, spreading documents across her desk. It's a federal designation that allows wildlife that can't be released to live with certified handlers and be used for educational purposes. Schools, community programs, conservation awareness. The animal lives with the handler full-time but has specific welfare requirements, enclosure standards, regular veterinary oversight. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, something that might have been hope but felt too fragile to name. You mean she could stay with me? Legally, yes. But there are significant requirements. The handler needs extensive certification, the State Wildlife Office has to approve, and there's a board hearing to ensure it serves legitimate educational purposes and isn't just someone keeping a pet wolf. It's rare, and it's never been granted in this state for a wolf. But Dr. Yuki looked at Noel, at the pup who'd nearly been killed trying to integrate with her own species, whose only chance at survival had been human intervention from the beginning. I think this might be one of those cases where the rules don't account for reality. She can't be wild. She can't be with other wolves. But she's alive, and she deserves a life, and maybe there's a way to give her that while also doing something valuable for wolf conservation. Sarah's mind was racing, years of professional training warring with desperate hope. What about Dr. Webb? He's the state wildlife director. He's the one who ordered her removal in the first place. He'll need to be convinced, Dr. Yuki said carefully. But I can testify as sanctuary director that integration isn't possible, that this is her only viable option besides euthanasia. If you want to fight for this, you'll need to fight hard. Documentation, facility specifications, a clear educational mission. You'll need to prove that what you're offering serves conservation, not just your attachment to her. Sarah looked down at Noel, at the pup who'd taught her how to feel again, who'd cracked through 3 years of isolation with nothing but trust and need and stubborn refusal to give up. How long do I have to prepare? The next board hearing is in 2 weeks. I'll contact Dr. Webb, get the application process started. But Sarah? Dr. Yuki's expression was serious. You need to understand what you're committing to. If they grant this license, Noel is yours for life. 15, maybe 20 years if she's healthy. She'll never be able to live anywhere else. You'll be responsible for her welfare, her housing, her medical care, all while maintaining educational programming and regular inspections. It's not just keeping a pet. It's a full-time job with legal obligations and public scrutiny. Sarah didn't hesitate. I understand. What do I need to do? The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Sarah worked 20-hour days, transforming part of the facility's unused outdoor space into a large naturalistic enclosure that met federal standards for ambassador animal housing. She compiled documentation, her credentials, Noel's complete medical history, detailed accounts of the failed integration attempt, letters of support from colleagues and veterinarians. She wrote a proposal for educational programming, outlining how Noel could help teach school children about wolf conservation, about the complexity of human-wildlife relationships, about the importance of habitat protection. She practiced her testimony until she had every statistic memorized, every argument polished, every potential objection answered. But as the hearing date approached, Sarah received unexpected help. Tom, the facility janitor, wrote a letter describing what he'd witnessed, Sarah's dedication, Noel's transformation from dying pup to thriving young wolf, the bond that had saved them both. Dr. Yuki submitted detailed testimony about the failed integration and her professional assessment that no sanctuary could meet Noel's needs. And then the local community, somehow having learned about the hearing, began sending letters of their own. Parents whose children had visited the facility and been moved by Noel's story. Teachers requesting educational programs. Conservation groups supporting the ambassador designation. By the day of the hearing, Sarah had over 200 letters of support, each one arguing that Noel's life had value, that her story could inspire others, that there was room in conservation for animals who didn't fit neat categories. The hearing was held in the State Wildlife Office conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and a long table where 5 board members sat, Dr. Webb among them. Sarah stood at a podium with Noel in a carrier beside her, her hand shaking slightly as she faced the people who would decide their future. She presented her case with methodical precision, walking through Noel's history, the medical documentation, the integration attempt, the proposed educational mission. She showed photographs of the completed enclosure, letters of support, her certification credentials. She answered questions about diet, veterinary care, public safety, long-term sustainability. And then Dr. Webb spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "Ms. Chen, I'm the one who ordered Noel's removal to sanctuary. I believed then, and I still believe, that preventing human-wildlife imprinting is crucial for the welfare of wild animals. What you're proposing contradicts decades of wildlife management principles. Why should we make an exception?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. Because Noel was already an exception from the moment she was abandoned. She was too small, too weak, born too late in the season. Nature had already decided she wasn't viable. I didn't create her vulnerability by forming a bond with her. I responded to it. She was dying, and I had seconds to make a choice. I chose her life over protocol. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "You asked what happens to wolves who can't be wild." Noel showed us the answer: they die, usually, because there's no place for them in our binary system. But what if there could be? What if we acknowledged that conservation isn't just about wild populations, but about individual lives that matter, about finding creative solutions instead of easy categories? Noel can't hunt or live with a pack, but she can help children understand why wolves matter, why habitat protection is crucial, why the wild is worth preserving. She can be a bridge between worlds. And maybe that's valuable too. The room was silent for a long moment. Then one of the board members, an older woman with kind eyes, asked, "Can you provide what she needs while respecting what she is?" Sarah thought about the question, about the weight of what she was promising. "I can try. I can give her space to run, exposure to natural environments, minimal interference beyond what her survival requires. I can honor her wolf nature even though she'll never be fully wild. And I can love her while remembering she's not mine to own, just mine to care for. Is that enough? I don't know. But I know it's more than the alternative." The board deliberated for 30 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah stood outside the conference room with Noel in her arms, the pup unusually quiet, as if she sensed the gravity of the moment. Dr. Yuki stood beside her, offering silent support. Finally, the door opened. Dr. Webb stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We've made a decision." Sarah's heart stopped. The board has voted to grant the Educational Ambassador Animal License, pending annual reviews and compliance inspections. Noel can stay with you. Sarah felt her knees weaken, felt tears sting her eyes, felt 3 years of grief and 2 months of terror transform into something that might have been joy if it wasn't so overwhelming. "There are conditions," Dr. Webb continued, but his voice had softened. "Strict welfare standards, mandatory educational programming, regular veterinary oversight. Any violation results in immediate license revocation." "But..." He paused, and something that might have been a smile touched his face. "I was wrong about absolutes. About thinking there's only one right way to handle every situation. She's alive because you broke the rules, and maybe there's value in acknowledging that. Good luck, Ms. Chen." As Dr. Webb walked away, Sarah held Noel close and whispered, "We get to stay together. You're coming home." And Noel, who couldn't possibly understand what had just happened but understood everything that mattered, licked Sarah's face and made that soft chirping sound that meant contentment, meant safety, meant family. 6 months passed like a dream, winter giving way to spring and then the full bloom of summer, the mountains transforming from white silence to green abundance. Noel grew, though she remained smaller than a typical wolf, her compact frame topping out at around 70 pounds instead of the 100 or more she should have reached. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in grace and intelligence and a temperament that continued to defy Sarah's expectations of wolf behavior. She was gentle where wolves were fierce, curious where they were wary, patient where they were predatory. She was, Sarah realized, exactly herself, not quite wolf, not quite domestic, something unique that existed in the spaces between categories. The educational programs exceeded every expectation. Sarah had worried that children would be frightened of Noel, that parents would object to bringing a wolf into schools. Instead, they were mesmerized. Noel would lie calmly during Sarah's presentations, allowing small groups to observe her from a safe distance while Sarah explained wolf biology, pack dynamics, conservation challenges. The children asked endless questions, their fascination with Noel translating into genuine interest in habitat protection and wildlife preservation. Teachers reported that students who'd met Noel became passionate advocates for conservation, that her story of survival and adaptation resonated in ways that textbook lessons never had. Noel seemed to enjoy the work, or at least tolerate it with remarkable patience. She learned to distinguish between work time and home time, between public appearances where she needed to be calm and private moments at the facility where she could play and explore. Sarah watched her navigate these different contexts with intelligence that seemed almost human, adjusting her behavior based on social cues in ways that suggested deep understanding. But the best moments were still the quiet ones, the early mornings when Sarah would sit in Noel's enclosure and watch the sun rise over the mountains, Noel curled beside her, both of them content in shared silence. They developed a language beyond words, communication through glances and touches and subtle shifts in posture. Sarah could read Noel's moods from the set of her ears, the tension in her shoulders, the pace of her breathing. And Noel, somehow, could read Sarah's emotional state with uncanny accuracy, offering comfort when Sarah was stressed, playfulness when she was sad, quiet companionship when she needed peace. Dr. Yuki visited regularly, conducting welfare assessments and documenting Noel's development for research on imprinting and human-wildlife bonds. "She's thriving," Dr. Yuki said during one visit, watching Noel investigate a new enrichment puzzle Sarah had built. "Physically healthy, behaviorally sound, emotionally stable. Whatever this relationship is, it's working. Is it fair to her, though?" Sarah asked, voicing the doubt that still haunted her during sleepless nights. She'll never know what it's like to hunt, to run with a pack, to be truly wild. Am I keeping her safe or keeping her captive? Dr. Yuki considered the question seriously. "I think you're doing something harder than either. You're giving her a life that honors both what she is and what she's become. She has space, enrichment, natural behaviors she can express. She has you, which shouldn't matter to a wolf but clearly matters to her. And she has purpose, contributing to conservation even though she can't live in the wild herself. Is it perfect? No. Is it the best possible option given her circumstances? I think yes." Sarah wanted to believe that, and most days she did. But there were moments when she'd watch Noel stand at the fence line of her enclosure, staring toward the mountains, and wonder what the pup was thinking, whether some part of her recognized what she was missing, whether the wildness in her blood called to places she'd never be able to go. One evening, as summer was shifting toward fall, Sarah was sitting in Noel's enclosure after a school visit. Exhausted but satisfied. Noel was sprawled beside her, panting contentedly after a play session. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, and from somewhere in the distant mountains came a sound that made both of them still, wolves howling. It was a wild pack, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies, singing to each other across the valleys in a language as old as the mountains themselves. Sarah held her breath, watching Noel, waiting to see if the sound would trigger some primal response, some longing for the life she'd never known. Noel lifted her head, ears pricked forward, listening intently. Then, slowly, she raised her muzzle and howled back. It was a beautiful sound, pure and haunting, and for a moment Sarah's heart broke, thinking this was it. This was Noel realizing what she was missing, crying out for the wild family she'd never have. But then Noel stopped howling, looked at Sarah, and moved closer, pressing her side against Sarah's leg. The wild wolves howled again, their chorus drifting through the twilight. Noel didn't respond this time, didn't seem troubled or distressed. She just leaned against Sarah, content in her choice, if it could be called a choice. "You heard them," Sarah whispered, stroking Noel's fur. They're out there, living the life you were meant to have. Does it hurt? Do you wish you could be with them? Noel made a soft sound, something between a sigh and a grumble, and laid her head in Sarah's lap. And Sarah understood, or thought she understood. Noel knew what she was. Knew the wolves in the mountains were her species, her biological family. But she'd made her own family here, in this unlikely bond with a human who'd saved her life and stayed to share it. Maybe that was enough. Maybe there was room in the world for different kinds of belonging, for connections that transcended biology and instinct and what was supposed to be natural. The summer faded into fall, and Sarah's transformation became visible to everyone who knew her. The colleagues who'd worried about her isolation noticed she was laughing again, engaging with others, no longer wearing loneliness like armor. She started accepting invitations to professional conferences, sharing Noel's story with other wildlife specialists, advocating for more nuanced approaches to human-wildlife relationships. She wasn't the same person who'd chosen isolation 3 years ago, who'd let one failure define her capacity for connection. Noel had changed that, had insisted through her mere existence that love was worth the risk of loss, that caring despite uncertainty was the only way to truly be alive. And Noel, for her part, continued to defy expectations and challenge assumptions about what wolves could be. She learned to ride in the truck for transport to schools, to walk on a leash through controlled environments, to tolerate children's excited voices and gentle touches through protective barriers. She became, in her own way, a teacher, showing people that wild things were complex and individual, that conservation meant respecting both species and specific lives, that the line between wild and domestic was far more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. Dr. Webb visited one afternoon, his first return since granting the license, and Sarah tensed, expecting criticism, waiting for him to find fault. Instead, he stood at the fence of Noel's enclosure and watched her play for a long time in silence. "I've been doing this work for 30 years, he said finally. Protecting wildlife, enforcing boundaries, maintaining the separation between humans and wild animals. I thought I knew all the answers, that the rules I'd learned were absolute. But watching you too." He paused, shaking his head slightly. "You've taught me that sometimes the right answer is the one that honors the individual in front of you, not the general principle. She's alive. She's thriving. She's helping people care about conservation. That matters more than my pride or my previous certainty." It was as close to an apology as someone in his position could offer, and Sarah felt something release in her chest, some last knot of defensiveness and fear finally loosening. "Thank you," she said simply. "For taking the risk. For trusting us." Dr. Webb nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "The world needs more people like you, Sarah. People willing to break rules for the right reasons, to fight for what matters even when it's difficult. Don't lose that." And Sarah, standing beside the enclosure where Noel was rolling in the grass with unself-conscious joy, thought about all the ways she'd been broken and rebuilt, how failure had taught her humility, how isolation had taught her the value of connection, how Noel had taught her that some bonds were worth any risk, any cost, any violation of what was supposed to be possible. Christmas Eve arrived again, 1 year exactly since the night that had changed everything, and Sarah found herself repeating the ritual she'd started that first terrible Christmas alone. She hung the red and white stocking, the same one she'd found Noel in, now cleaned and preserved, on a hook inside Noel's enclosure. It had become a symbol between them, a marker of their unlikely beginning, a reminder that miracles sometimes came in the form of impossible survival and unexpected love. Noel was sprawled in her favorite spot, a raised platform that gave her a view of both her enclosure and the mountains beyond, and she watched Sarah hang the stocking with mild interest, her storm-gray eyes calm and content. She was beautiful at 9 months old, her gray and white fur thick and glossy, her movements confident and coordinated, so different from the dying pup who'd fit in Sarah's palm. But she was still small, still uniquely herself, still the creature who defied every expectation and created a category of her own. Sarah sat beside her on the platform, both of them looking out at the mountains where snow was beginning to fall again, each flake catching the last light of day. A year ago, Sarah had been alone, isolated by choice, convinced that keeping everyone at a distance was the only way to protect herself from more pain. A year ago, she'd been haunted by failure, unable to forgive herself for the wolf she couldn't save, unable to imagine that there might be different kinds of success, different ways to measure what mattered. And then she'd heard crying in a stocking, and everything had changed. "You saved me," Sarah said quietly to Noel, though she knew the pup couldn't understand the words. "I thought I was saving you, but you saved me first. You reminded me what it feels like to care about something more than my own comfort, to fight for a life even when the odds are impossible, to risk being hurt because the alternative is being numb. You gave me back a part of myself I thought I'd lost." Noel shifted closer, pressing her side against Sarah's, and made that soft chirping sound that meant contentment, meant I'm here, meant this is where I belong. Sarah wrapped an arm around her, feeling the steady rise and fall of Noel's breathing, the solid warmth of her body, the absolute trust in the way she leaned into the embrace. They sat together as darkness fell and snow continued to accumulate, woman and wolf, professional and patient, human and wild thing, all those categories that didn't quite capture what they actually were to each other. Family, maybe, though that word felt too simple. Partners in survival. Proof that connection could transcend every boundary, every rule, every assumption about what was possible or appropriate or natural. Sarah thought about the wild wolves in the mountains, the ones Noel would never run with, never hunt alongside, never know as pack. She thought about the perfect wildlife Noel would never have, the instincts that would never be tested, the territories that would never be claimed. And she felt a flicker of sadness for everything Noel had lost by being saved. But then she thought about the children who'd learned to care about conservation because Noel had made wolves real to them, tangible and individual and worthy of protection. She thought about the other wildlife specialists who'd reached out after hearing their story, asking questions about imprinting and individual welfare and how to balance species conservation with specific lives. She thought about her own transformation, from isolated and numb to connected and purposeful, from haunted by failure to accepting complexity. Some connections transcended the categories humans created, transcended wild and domestic, transcend human and animal, transcended what was supposed to be possible. Sarah had learned that isolation wasn't safety, it was just fear wearing a disguise, that the only way to truly live was to risk being hurt, to open yourself to connection even knowing it came with the possibility of loss. She'd learned that love didn't require similarity or even mutual understanding, just presence and persistence and willingness to fight for something that mattered. Noel stretched, yawned, and settled her head on Sarah's lap with a sigh of perfect contentment. And Sarah sat with her as the snow fell and the night deepened, both of them warm and safe and together, both of them exactly where they belonged. The mountains were dark now, silent except for the wind, and Sarah whispered into the quiet, "You should never have survived. By every law of nature, you should have died that night. But you didn't. You fought, and I fought for you, and here we are. Changed. Connected. Alive in ways that matter more than any rule or regulation or supposed impossibility." Noel's breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep, her body relaxed and trusting against Sarah's, and Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of the overwhelming recognition that sometimes the best things in life came from breaking rules for the right reasons, from choosing connection over caution, from believing that individual lives mattered enough to fight for even when the world said otherwise. She looked at the stocking hanging on the wall, that symbol of their impossible beginning, and then at Noel sleeping peacefully in her lap, proof that impossible things happened every day if you were brave enough to reach for them. And she thought about all the ways they'd saved each other, how Noel had needed Sarah's warmth and care and stubborn refusal to accept death, how Sarah had needed Noel's trust and presence and absolute certainty that connection was worth any risk. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the world in white silence, and from somewhere far in the mountains came the distant howl of wild wolves, singing their ancient songs to the winter night. Noel stirred in her sleep, ears twitching, but didn't wake, didn't cry out to join them. She was at peace here, in this space between wild and domestic, in this life that honored both what she was born as and what she'd become. And Sarah sat with her through the night, this strange and beautiful creature who'd taught her everything that mattered about love and loss and the courage it took to keep trying even after failure, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again, would reach into that frozen stocking again, would break every rule again, because some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. worth the inevitable complexity and uncertainty and pain that came with caring deeply about another life. She should never have heard the crying at all, but she did, and everything was different now, and Sarah wouldn't change a single moment of it, not the fear or the fight or the impossible love that had grown from a Christmas Eve miracle in a stocking, not the bond that had healed them both, not the life they built together in the spaces between what was supposed to be possible. The night was quiet except for the wind and Noel's peaceful breathing and the steady beat of two hearts, human and wolf, keeping time together in the darkness, and Sarah held on and was grateful and knew that this, exactly this, was what it meant to be alive.